Yeah, it's funny because like some people think that people with a CS degree have an advantage in these interviews, and I would argue actually the opposite. And I think there are a lot of people who agree with me here. If anything, these algorithm-style interviews actually level the playing field.
Welcome to the next episode of the Tech Track series. My guest for today, who I'm really excited about, is Clement, who is the co-founder and CEO of Algoexpert, which is an amazing resource to prepare for coding interviews, which is actually the topic for our discussion. We talked about some of the common mistakes we see with these software interviews, along with a broader discussion about the effectiveness of these data structure and algorithm questions for an engineering job. So if you like this kind of content, please hit that like button and subscribe. And I'll leave links to all of Clement's social media, his large YouTube channel, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. in the description. Let me know what questions or comments you have, and enjoy. So I want to start out actually with the rapid fire. So don't take too long. Just give me what's on the top of your mind, just to get to know you quickly. So first off, What are 3 words to describe yourself?
3 words to describe myself. Ooh, that's harder than it sounds. Ambitious, lighthearted, I suppose, and outspoken.
Like it. Okay. A lifestyle change that you've made during the COVID pandemic.
Because it coincided with my being full-time on Algoexpert, no longer treating it as a side business while having a full-time job, I was able to sleep in more and go to bed much later than I usually did when I had a full-time job.
I like it. Catching up on sleep during the pandemic. I like that. And then what is one piece of advice that has changed your life?
So this might sound kind of silly or stereotypical, but I would say probably the fact that anything you see around yourself, like any product or company or service, was created by another human being, and there's nothing preventing you from making your mark on the world and creating some product or service.
I want to start off with by asking you about the practicality of interviewing. Prior to founding Algoexpert, you worked at Google and then Facebook. So clearly you kind of mastered the art of getting into these top companies. When you were actually working at Facebook and Google, how often did you apply the data structure and algorithm skills that you teach about now on the job?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think it's got kind of a nuanced answer in the sense that, on the one hand, no, I didn't really use, or I didn't use often the data structures and algorithm skills, because if you think about it, like a lot of people who criticize these interviews say, you're not really inverting binary trees on the job, you're not really using dynamic programming in your everyday programming life. On the other hand, I certainly used the skills assessed in these interviews on the job. First of all, because sometimes there are actually some interview problems that are legitimate problems that you encounter on the job. As an example, there's a pretty famous calendar matching algorithm problem where you're trying to see what time intervals overlap for a calendar. That's the classic thing that you might work on, let's say, Google Calendar. I've always given the example on Algoexpert that our questions list, where you can reorder questions or change their how they're grouped, that involves a lot of actual algorithms, behind the scenes in our code. But then also just beyond that, at the end of the day, these interviews, and we'll touch on this, I think, in some of the other questions you want to ask me, these interviews test problem solving. And so you're problem solving every day, on the job as a software engineer. So from that point of view, then I certainly used all these skills.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like there are certainly parts of it that actually are applicable to what you do running a startup and also on the job, but also a lot of it that isn't applicable. So it kind of begs the question of, is this the most efficient way to get that signal? Like if you had a magic wand and you could reinvent the process for which people get evaluated to get into these top companies, how would you change the process, or would you?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And again, I want to make it clear that I am not really biased here. I know that some people think I'm biased because I run a technical interview prep company, but at the end of the day, If these interviews end up changing, which I don't think they will anytime soon, then so be it. So here my answer is really, I'm trying to be as unbiased as possible. And I would argue that the point is we do not have a magic wand. We don't have a magic wand that can tell us whether a candidate is good for a company or not. And because of that, these technical interviews or coding interviews, and then there are also systems design interviews, but those are a bit different. They happen to be the best thing that we currently know to interview candidates at scale. That's a key point, at scale, meaning like hundreds of interviews per week at these big tech companies in a standardized way, in a way that can be taught to engineers who are conducting the interviews. That's the only way. And then the second point that I just want to make here is that take a company like Google. Google has been in the business of interviewing software engineering candidates for, 20 years. It would be, I think, kind of silly, if not, way too overly confident to assume that Google doesn't know what they're doing. Like, they've definitely invested time into this and collected data and so on and so forth. And that probably has led them to believe that this is the best way to interview their candidates. So that's another kind of way to think about it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's kind of the story about Google, I think, makes a lot of sense to me because they have these world-class experts in terms of, evaluation and how do you assess on-the-job performance and getting people in the door. And, clearly if, you have dozens of smart people or hundreds of smart people who have landed upon that system, even if it's imperfect, some parts of it are working. So I think that's a pretty strong signal that, it does work to some extent.
Yeah.
But, one of the interesting things that you said is that at scale, where like you have hundreds of interviews happening each week. So when you think about smaller companies, like small or mid-sized companies, which may not have the need to interview at that level, do you think that there's a better way for them to operate interviews? Because I think what happens oftentimes is like you basically have this mentality, if you're like a small company, if it worked for the big company, it must be good enough for me. It must work for me, right? Kind of this blind copying mentality. So do you think that happens too frequently in the Valley? Or like what are other ways for smaller companies to evaluate candidates?
Well, so that's a good question. And I think that probably is going to depend on the company. I do agree that like this interview process for Google, Facebook, Amazon at scale doesn't necessarily lend itself perfectly to other types of companies, to smaller companies, especially the smaller you are. As an example, on Algoexpert, if we were hiring a software engineer tomorrow, right? While we might evaluate them with at least like one interview, that's an algorithm interview, just to assess the skills that type of interview assesses, like, you can see how do they solve a difficult problem in 45 minutes or how do they approach it. But apart from that, we would likely also assess other things. As an example, if we were hiring a front-end engineer, we would actually make sure that they know React, they know TypeScript, that's what we use. Can they dive into the code base really quickly? Because we need that, right? As a small company, we need that. A Google doesn't really care if you know Angular as a front-end engineer because you can learn it on the job, right? When they hire you, they're expecting you not to be productive for the first 6 months, which is kind of crazy to think about, but that's kind of how it is, right? So yes, I do think that smaller companies probably can benefit from at least mixing other types of interviews, and I think that some of them do. I think you see more and more companies that have like slightly different interview styles. But the one caveat there is that like then you start getting other criticism where you start doing, let's say, a take-home project, and people complain about take-home projects because those also have their own, negatives, like the time commitment and the fact that it's not really standardized and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about the, Google and Facebook, and these other big companies, they essentially are a bubble where the technologies you use there are oftentimes very custom for that company. And so you're right that, a lot of the assessment there is more about general problem solving because you're gonna have to relearn a lot of the technology anyway when you join the company. Whereas a company like Algoexpert, you're probably using much more off-the-shelf technology compared to something like Fang, which they have their own custom version of everything.
Definitely.
Cool. And then I'm wondering, a lot of people who want to break into tech, they may not have the traditional 4-year computer science degree. They're coming either from a boot camp or they're self-taught. Do you have different advice for people who are preparing for interviews if they have the theoretical underpinnings of a CS degree versus a bootcamp degree or like a bootcamp program?
Yeah, it's funny because like some people think that people with a CS degree have an advantage in these interviews, and I would argue actually the opposite. And I think there are a lot of people who agree with me here. If anything, these algorithm-style interviews actually level the playing field. Now, you could actually debate me on whether or not leveling the playing field is even needed or warranted, because perhaps a CS degree is important to have. But assuming you agree that leveling the playing field, regardless of kind of like educational background, is the way to go, which I'm inclined to believe it is, then they do level the playing field because there's actually a surprisingly little amount of knowledge, of like CS knowledge, that you need for these interviews. You do need some data structures knowledge, right? You need to know, let's say, how a hash table works, how a tree works. You need to know like the logarithm. But these are all pretty simple concepts that can be taught pretty quickly. And as an example, not to shamelessly plug Algoexpert, but like we have a data structures crash course on the platform. It's something like 4 or 5 hours of video content. And it really gives you everything that you need to be able to tackle an algorithm problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like a lot of the concepts that you learn in a CS degree, to the extent that you need it in an interview, those can be taught relatively quickly. You don't need to go to school for 2, 3, 4 years to do all that. It can be much more compressed. And you can also save a bunch of money. You don't have to pay, tens of thousands of dollars for it.
Yeah.
Cool. And then, you mentioned how these data structure and algorithm questions, they do a reasonable job assessing problem solving. There's also a lot that goes into an interview which is beyond problem solving. Things like, culture fit, or does this person have a good attitude, or, communication. Like how effectively are you able to communicate when you get stuck, or how do you ask for help? Things like that. So do you have advice about that? What's the best way to prepare for that kind of assessment?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people, again, don't realize or overlook when they criticize coding interviews. These interviews do a surprisingly good job at assessing these other dimensions in a 45-minute time block. And I would say, the key there is to practice and to also be intentional in your practicing. In other words, of course you want to practice your algorithms and data structures by doing practice coding interview problems, like all the ones that we have on Algoexpert. But then when you're practicing them, you want to also make sure that you're practicing your problem solving. So when you're doing a problem, you want to make sure that you're thinking about how you can approach it, thinking about asking clarifying questions, thinking about the trade-offs that you're making, right? And to some extent, this is implicit in the practice that you do, because it's very hard to do well on these problems. Like just approaching a coding interview problem implicitly involves problem solving, right? But flexing those muscles and being intentional about it, and then maybe practicing like talking out loud or doing mock interviews. We have mock interviews on the platform for your communication. That's how you're going to kind of get into the mindset of doing well in those other dimensions.
Yeah, I think that the one thing that really helped me was externalizing my thought process, because it's so easy to get stuck in your head and write some notes. But when you actually have a human, a person who's watching you, or a friend even, who's kind of doing this mock interview, it's a way better representation of like what you'll actually go through, right? Because you have to start talking out loud, explaining your thought process, and being able to field questions from the interviewer. So
definitely,
that helps a lot. Cool. And then the other thing about interviews is that it's a two-way street, right? It's not just the company evaluating you. If you're a strong candidate, you can easily get 3, 4, 5 or more offers. So do you have any thoughts about how to best evaluate the company in the interview process?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think it's a tough one to answer, because I think it might be more doable at certain companies and less doable at others. In other words, I think that for the big companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, those are tougher to evaluate from the interviews. In other words, like an interview at Google, let's say, one interview or 2 interviews, what will they really tell you about what it's like to work at Google? Not much. If you get a great experience or a poor experience, just, you're not vibing with the interview or the interviewer, that doesn't really say much about Google. That just says something about like the one person you fell on, you know? So I think it's hard to evaluate those just from the interviews. And if anything, you need to evaluate them from, you know, what you read about them online or what you read about them or hear about them from other engineers. I think you can always, of course, ask some questions at the end of the interview. Usually they leave like room for one question where you can ask them like, hey, what's your day-to-day like? Or what are you working on today? But again, I don't know that it'll give you that much information that you can't get elsewhere. I think for smaller companies, there you can get a better sense. Because for smaller companies, you'll, you know, how the recruiter speaks to you, the types of interviews that you do, the types of people that you meet, they might be more representative of the way the company is like run. And again, even here, I'm kind of making a generalization. And I will say as a final point, I realize that this is kind of a disorganized answer, but as a final point, I will say that like right now with the whole remote interviewing and all that, it might be even harder to assess what a company is like because you're not like in the office, you're not seeing people at the office. So also try to read a lot about like their about page and their culture there and all that.
Do you have some like go-to questions to ask people to get a flavor for the company? Like for example, like what I tell people who ask me is like, ask me a question like, how big is your team? That's not a great question because it's like a concrete answer and doesn't really reveal anything about how you might be happy on the team or whether you'll be happy or not, right? Because that's going to change over time.
Yeah.
So do you have, like you mentioned, tell me about your day-to-day. Do you have other kind of go-to questions that are revealing in some way?
So I don't know that these are necessarily revealing for what you'll experience at the company, but questions that I do like to ask because they tend to be just like challenging questions, you know, they make the interviewer kind of pause and think, are things like, what do you dislike about working at
I like that.
Fubar? Or what was the hardest thing you've ever had to do at this company? You almost like throw a behavioral interview question at them, and you might get, at the very least, like an interesting reply. Whether that'll be something that really gives you much info about what life would be like for you there, I don't know, but it's at least interesting.
Yeah, I like that. I feel like having that a little bit of a more challenging question back at them, especially if they're in the news. Like I think a lot of big tech companies have been dragged through the mud recently. It's like being able to say, hey, I know this incident happened. What do you think about it? Those oftentimes are very revealing to think about, does this employee actually believe in the company? Do they have an eloquent answer to what happened and why it happened? And are you satisfied with that? So I feel like those kind of questions are great.
Agreed. Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting, especially tying it back to like maybe something that's happening, you know, with the company in public or something.
Wrapping up here, is there a particular mistake that you see candidates make again and again in the interview process that, you know, we can all learn from? And what is that mistake?
Yeah, I would say probably two mistakes. One is candidates just practicing incorrectly. Candidates who think that they either need to memorize solutions and then regurgitate them in interviews. It's not going to help you, especially at big tech companies that kind of know to give novel questions. You really want to make sure you actually understand like problem solving and the fundamentals. You don't want to be regurgitating things that you've memorized. And also understanding time complexity, space complexity, because that's what's going to kind of differentiate a good solution from a bad one. Some people think that they're passing all the test cases when they're practicing, but make sure to go understand, you know, do you have the most optimal solution? And is that why you're passing the test cases? But then the second one is communication. I think that's the often overlooked one. I'm a firm believer that communication can make or break you in an interview. Like it can be the thing that if you're a bad communicator, even if you're great at the other things, you end up getting rejected. And conversely, if you're, let's say, just kind of average or you kind of mess up one or two algorithms, but you're great at communicating and explaining your thoughts and trade-offs and all that, that can actually save you.
Yeah, I like that. So like really going a little bit deeper and trying to understand the kind of theoretical underpinnings and not just regurgitating answers. And also the communication, 100% agree. That's probably the biggest thing when I've done interviews is that, you know, people are stuck in their head. They don't communicate with me for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and I just have no idea what they're thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. Any last thoughts, any last words, Clement?
No, just thanks for having me. Thanks for letting me shamelessly plug Algoexpert, and I'm excited to now do the video on my channel where we're gonna kind of dive into your job as a staff software engineer.
Yeah, perfect. I really appreciate you coming on. I'll leave links to all your socials. You have a huge YouTube channel, LinkedIn following, Twitter. I'll leave all that below, along with, of course, Algoexpert. I really appreciate the time, and thanks for coming on.